and finally Kingston before returning home to Canada. He is very much looking forward to working with us as a co-facilitator this afternoon. So, Mr. Delves, good evening to you. Oh, and we have Ms. Mohes on the screen here. Here's Mr. I think Mr. Delves is there. So, as I said before, we have a very interesting topic. We know that teachers go through a lot of stress in and out of the classroom, and dealing with teachers' mental health is a very, very important thing. So at this time, I will hand the floor over to our first presenter, Ms. Andrea Gay Mohes. So Ms. Mohes, I'm going to leave it all up to you now.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for having myself and Wes presenting this evening. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, we are hearing you clearly.
Okay, good. So as our presenters stated, I am a counseling psychologist by profession. I've been in the practice for approximately 9 years now, going into my 10th year. And I'm currently doing my doctoral studies in behavioral health leadership, specializing in women and child adolescent health, right? So this evening, Wes and I will be presenting on mental health and the teacher. And this is a very important topic given the fact that teachers are going through so many different changes that are impacting their mental health, but not only their mental health, but their ability to feel comfortable within their role as teachers. So Wes, before I continue, you can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Andrea. Can everybody hear me? Yep, good, thanks. Well, the introduction at the beginning was great. Thank you very much for that. Andrea and I will do a little bit of back and forth instead of doing two separate presentations. I will interject when I have some classroom experiences or some resources that we've developed here in Canada at the CTF or other resources that we have found that I would like to share that I think would be very helpful. So thank you very much. And Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Wes. So this evening, we're going to be looking at understanding the difference between mental health and mental illness. We're also going to be helping you to understand how mental health influences you as a teacher. We're going to raise awareness on practices, skills, and values to develop good mental health. Also to look at raising awareness on policies and practices to promote wellness in the classroom, both virtually and face-to-face. Further along in our presentation, we're going to be looking at tips to assist you in preparing to head back into the classroom, especially that there are a lot of uncertainty surrounding entering into our face-to-face setting. And we're going to touch a bit on that as well. And also we want to encourage you to practice healthy self-care methods and also focus on not just surviving as a teacher in a classroom, but also thriving, and how healthy mental health practices can help you thrive as a professional. Okay. So what is mental health? And you know, there's conversation around mental health, and we always focus on mental illness. But mental health looks at the whole person. It looks at well-being, both psychologically, emotionally, spiritually. It also focuses on the environment. It focuses a lot also on different skills and how we demonstrate and how we shift within our environment and what cognitive abilities we use to shift within our environment. Another word we want to highlight with mental health is executive functioning. And we have different levels of teachers within this platform. And you might have heard about executive function. It looks at the ability to regulate emotion, to regulate your behavior, and to regulate yourself, especially when faced with adversity or any sudden changes. Another huge element of mental health is interpersonal relationships. And as a counseling psychologist, one of my training and practice and function is to look at how the environment and relationships impact you as an individual. And when we talk about mental health, we also look at how do we relate to others? How do we relate in our environment? How does our culture impact us in terms of how we think and how we perceive the world around us? And it's important as well when we're thinking about mental health and good mental health practices to think about creating a psychologically healthy environment. And there's another word that comes up a lot in mental health, or even mental health practices, which is psychological safety. How can we create an environment for our teachers and even our students, the students on different levels, whether it's adult learning, early childhood, adolescence, do we create a healthy space for them, and how our interaction with them also affects our mental health as an individual. Right. So this evening as well, and Wes is more practical in terms of being a teacher. So we thought it's important to really highlight and to remind you of, who is a teacher? What are your tasks? What is your role? And for the last 2 years, we've experienced a lot of changes in education and teaching practice. And one of the things that we came up with is a teacher is a person who imparts not only knowledge and expertise to another person, but also they give parts of themselves to persons as well, their authentic self. A part of the ethics and the whole element and standards and values of a teacher is someone who's compassionate, also someone who's empathetic, who's creative, who's reflective, who can develop strategies. And one of the beauties of being a teacher as well, which is something that I think is overlooked, that you're resourceful, right? You utilize the resources that you have, but you're able to execute your task with very little or a lot of resources if you do have those resources. And the last 2 years has really challenged your definition of what teaching is, but it's also raised a lot of strengths and highlighted your role within the community in terms of we're able to create and pivot. Although it has been a very anxiety-provoking time, we are understanding our role as teachers in our community and in our society. Okay. Wes, is there anything you want to interject here before I move on?
Thanks, Andrea. Just to add that, Andrea is talking about being resourceful, and that's very, very important. But you need to remember that resourceful does not necessarily mean that you are the only one who is seeking out those resources. Your colleagues, your administrators, your family members are also valuable resources. So they might have some refreshing, some new, some different ideas that might inform your resourcefulness, they might have ideas for how to teach in a virtual setting, or they might have new and refreshing ideas for how to teach in the classroom. So remember not to always rely on yourself, because there are other sources of excellent ideas that we can draw upon. Thank you.
So we're going to get into our presentation a little more in depth in terms of preparations for the classroom. And there's so many, we have 2 sets of classroom settings now that we have to focus on. And it not only affects the tertiary level, but it affects all levels and all different levels of education. So we have that big word, technology, right? How do we prepare for the classroom, in a virtual space? But also there are some teachers who are going back into a physical space, even though there are some levels of uncertainty. How do we prepare for that? And one of the challenges we even highlighted that sometimes are overlooked is the generational and cultural gaps between the student and the teacher, and even in the teacher-teacher dynamic, where you have new teachers, older teachers, administration pulls that can create certain advantages and disadvantages and certain different mental health challenges within the teaching environment or within the education environment. And one of the things we want to explore is that culture change over time. And if we're not able to be adaptable and resilient, what happens is there's a shift and there's a rift between the dynamic of the student and the teacher-teacher relationship, where it can become very strained and it can create dynamics that can put a strain on mental health of a teacher. So things that you can experience in preparing if these cultural and generational gaps or shifts are not addressed, is in high levels of stress, also a lack of boundaries between each other, and also what we can have are situations of conflict that can arise. And the other element in terms of preparing for the classroom is privacy and confidentiality, in the sense, especially in the virtual space. So understanding how do we create a private space where we're exposed using technology and using different devices, also understanding that we're also in having the students invade our space, because even though you're not in my home physically, you're actually a part of my space and you're seeing into a space that I probably would not have allowed you to come in as well. How do we look at that in terms of preparing for the classroom? Also, responses to social justice and cultural change. There's certain things in terms of in our society where we're just going to briefly touch on, the change in dynamics and culture in terms of how young people express themselves. How do we deal with situations of LGBTQI groups coming into that space? How does that affect our culture, even our classroom within that space? How do we respond to those changes? Relationships, our relationship with the student, our relationship with each other. Sometimes children with behavioral challenges, especially in the virtual space where you can control or have that much control, how do we even set those boundaries and structures in place within the virtual setting? How do the dynamics between ourselves and the student, how does that affect our relationship with the student in terms of how we look at them, how much investment we make in them? Also, our teacher-teacher relationship, how do those relationships impact each other in preparing for the classroom? Do we communicate well? Do we give information out clearly? Is there a sense of camaraderie and communion and commitment to what our goal and our mission and our vision is as a teaching setting, right? And even looking at language, in terms of how do we speak to each other, not necessarily in terms of accents or phonetics, but in terms of, are we speaking empathetically? Are we speaking in a caring tone? Are we paying attention to what we say to each other in terms of preparing for that? And that impacts mental health significantly, because it also helps us to understand how we are setting the tone in terms of coming back into a space. Now that we're preparing for a new school term, what type of language do we use? Because we are all experiencing a lot of this, we all have experienced a lot of trauma within the past few months, especially in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We're now, we had a volcanic eruption a few months ago. We now have a spike in COVID cases. We're going through a pandemic. So how do we set that tone in terms of managing anxieties for ourselves, but also for our students, right? Wes, is there anything you want to share before I move on?
Yeah, just wanted to share that someone added in the chat our intonations that we use when we speak.
Right.
Also, I would suggest our body language.
Mhm.
And as you are all know, you're all experienced teachers. You set the tone for the classroom, right? And children are incredibly intelligent and incredibly sensitive. So if you come into the classroom at the beginning of the day and you are already stressed and anxious, they know that, they can read that. And that has an effect on their day as well. So it's really, really important. And I think Andrew is going to get into this in a little bit more detail later, is that when you start your day positive, make sure that you are sending out positive body language and positive messages, because that sets the tone for the classroom. If your mood changes, the children will pick up on that, and that will have an effect on their behavior. So it's very important to be mindful of, and that's where the executive function comes in that Andrea was talking about. You need to be able to monitor yourself. And if something happens that triggers something for you, you need to be able to know how to manage that so that you can maintain that positive classroom environment so that learning can take place.
Right. And also to build on that to Wes, in terms of looking at human-friendly environments, not only looking at yourself in terms of gauging yourself, but also as a community, as a school, as a system, how are we also checking in with each other to ensure that we're creating those human-friendly environments, focusing on well-being, focusing not only on scrutiny, but also looking at growth. How are we growing each other within that space? And most importantly, boundaries. How are we setting boundaries with ourselves, setting boundaries with our students, and how are we encouraging our students as well to be able to engage with us in a level that helps us to grow, but also helps them to grow. And that impacts your mental health. So we also look at teachers as persons who build and who create structures, but sometimes that structure and that sense of authority can also make you lose your humanness and also raise stress as well, because there's that focus on just getting the work done and miss that whole human element. And how you manage that stress also helps you to either survive or to thrive. And that is something we're going to get into deeper in terms of looking at mental health as a whole and not necessarily just focusing on the other extremes of mental health, which is mental illness. We want to help to gauge you before that stems into a situation of mental illness. Right? So we're going to talk about, in terms of going deeper in preparing for the classroom, self-care. And we're looking at self-care on 2 dimensions, where we're looking at the inner wheel or the inner self-care. And I've found this image, and I think it's very important, because sometimes we look at self-care as just external, but most importantly, it's internal as well, because sometimes we can't control every element of the external, but we can control ourselves. So I want you to reflect, and as you look at the wheel, think about, when was the last time I took a step back, right? Have I been doing that, right? And all of us are guilty sometimes for overcommitting to things, to saying yes to things. When was the last time I asked for help? So I am trying to create this classroom plan or this classroom structure for my online class, or if we're going back into face-to-face and I feel stuck. Do I have a mentor, somebody that I can reach out to, or do I struggle with that because it makes me think about, do I appear incompetent? Am I struggling with that? The next one, again, boundaries. Am I setting boundaries with people? Am I answering my phone all the time? Am I paying attention to what I'm taking into my space? Do I feel comfortable saying no? And what does no mean to me? And that is also incorporated in self-care. Sometimes we have to tell some persons no. Am I putting myself first? Now, this is a very tricky one based on culture as well, especially because the Minnesota and Grenadines also is a very Christian culture and a very religious perspective sometimes. And you may think about, I have to put others first. But one of the key elements, even in Christianity, is love your neighbor as yourself. So if you don't love yourself first, if you can't take care of yourself first, you can't help your neighbor, because you're giving out of an empty cup. So it's important to think about those different things in terms of that inner self-care. And am I asking for what I need? In terms of, do I have the opportunity to ask what I need? And this is also something you can think of at an administrative level. If I'm looking at the individual, am I providing those avenues as well for them to ask for what they need and to cater for these things, right? Wes, is there anything you want to add before I move on?
Sure. Yes, Andrea, I'd like to share something similar at this time that we developed here at the CTF for back to school, actually last year in 2020, because as you know, the pandemic started in 2019. And so I'm just, allow me to share my screen here.
Okay, I think I could stop mine.
Okay. All right, so.
I think, right.
Okay, so you can see this CTF FSA advocacy. You see the screen?
Yes, I'm seeing
Yes,
it.
good. Okay. So thank you. So one of the things I'm going to show you on this is a website, and I will put the link in the chat a little bit later on, and I will provide all of this to the SVGTU so that they can send this out to you. But if you go, you'll have the link. If you go under resources, then continuity of learning, and then I've got to move everybody over there so I can access it, and then support. And I'm going to scroll down here, and here we've developed a poster. Okay, and we called it a blueprint for a different kind of back to school. So what I'm going to actually do is scroll down and actually show you a larger version of it so that you can see what I'm talking about here. People are getting in the way. Here we go. So this is what we developed. And these are things that are good, not only for students, but also for teachers. And so they can be as simple as laugh, exercise, eat healthy, connect, go inwards, which means do some reflection, unplug, no electronics, none of that. Volunteer, there are all of these strategies. And then at the bottom of the poster, of course, these are national resources that we developed from Canada, but there's also a space here for local resources. So you could download this poster, print it off yourselves or have someone print it off for you and put local resources here or ideas, anything you want. But this is a very, very, very good poster that we found is very helpful for both teachers and students alike. And I do want to point out that on this poster, the most important strategy, of course, is reaching out when you need to and not going through the journey alone. And that, again, is good for students and for teachers. So as I said, I will put the link to this particular site in the chat, and you will be able to use it as you wish. Thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome. And what Wes was showing is where you're creating a mental health friendly space for your students as well. So one thing, even in my own practice, not necessarily in St. Vincent, but when I worked in Trinidad before, we, in our playroom for students, we put emotions and we put different things to make the space child friendly. And even for adults or even in tertiary setting, you can create different creative and fun ways to promote wellness. Because what you're doing is as well, you're helping your students to check in on you too, when you are also at your lowest point and you're creating that sense of authenticity. It's not that you're burdening each other with what's happening, because in some moments you need to reach out to some sort of professional help. But it's promoting a space that we're looking at our whole selves. So when we look at wellness, you tend to see the information on 8 dimensions. So you have spiritual health, you have intellectual wellness, you have emotional wellness, you have physical wellness, social, occupational, financial, and environmental. And if we're looking at ourselves on a whole, all of these things impact how we feel, how we think, and how we see the world. So what we want to encourage you today is to create a structure that helps you to focus on all these different things. If one is lacking, it affects the whole. So if you're having financial struggles, you are going to be affected in terms of your health, your nutrition, your social interaction, how you feel about your job, how you feel about your environment. If your environment is clustered, that affects your mental health. So if you're working in a space that your environment is not healthy, or you're living in a space where your environment is not healthy, that affects your mental health as well, and your sense of wellness. So in terms of looking at the classroom, some of the tips that we want to look at in terms of promoting mental health and wellness is creating that structure, even in a virtual or face-to-face space. So if my So if my memory serves me right, and even interacting with teachers in my own practice, most of your training based on your timeline, especially when you would have studied, would have focused on creating those face-to-face structures. So you create spaces like your classroom setting, your how you lay out your space. There wasn't enough material, or even if there was material, nobody probably focused on it before the pandemic. So our encouragement to you is, if you're looking at your self-care and your well-being, is to create that structure within your framework or your lesson plan for both a virtual space and a face-to-face space, where you set up rules for yourself and for your students. So if you're worried about connectivity in a virtual space, you can set rules where all your students have on their cameras and they mute them. One of the best things about students, and no matter their age group, is they adapt easily, especially younger ones, once there is structure. And it also helps you out, because then you're able to see what's happening and you feel a little more in control, and it doesn't raise your anxiety levels because you have a plan and you have an idea where we're going. We have an idea of where we're going in terms of creating that structure. The next one is those mental health check-ins and to check the temperature. And as Wes said, in terms of having that posted there is where we're reminding wellness, but we also have a check-in before we start class. Not just saying, you know, how do you feel? Because sometimes that can sound inauthentic and it could sound like it's just casual, but doing an activity, especially with little ones, to check that emotional temperature. So whether it's a game, it could be, and we have activities later down that we're going to show you as well that you can do to engage. One of the things I recognize, especially working with children, is to create a routine. So if you incorporate that mental health check-in in your routine in terms of your warm-up, in my practice, we had a feelings handbag. So you'll take out a feeling and you'll ask yourself, okay, how am I feeling today? So that engages, but it also encourages laughter. It also encourages a light space. And even with COVID, one of the things you can do is create a method of maintaining the protocols, even if it's in a face-to-face setting. So when I work with little ones, sometimes I would say, okay, we do air high fives because we want to still have that engagement, or we do high fives and sanitize after, because we are encouraging that protocol, but we're also not allowing ourselves to become overwhelmed or anxious, because especially in the pandemic space, there's a lot to think about. And when there's a lot to think about, it increases anxiety. But one of the things with trauma is continuous if there is no closure or there is no meaning. So because the brain is searching for meaning and we're kind of adjusting and we have all these changes happening, it can also cause behavioral challenges, not only for the students, but for you as well. You can find yourself shouting. So it's really important to pay attention to yourself. Know what you can handle, what you can't handle. So for example, if you get really flustered when things change rapidly, find a way to slow it down a bit. Take a step back, speak to a colleague, pay attention to what affects you. The next one is emotions, focusing on mindfulness, regulation, empathy, and problem solving. And what mindfulness is staying in the present. What causes us to get frustrated or sometimes easily flustered, if we're looking too far into the past or if we're looking too far into the future. So one of the things I tend to hear in terms of the narrative or the conversation, the virtual space is very difficult. It is very difficult to navigate. But the thing is that if you continue the perception of difficulty, it will become even more difficult because you're not allowing yourself to adapt or to be resilient in terms of moving forward with this mechanism. So what happens is you're then dysregulating yourself continuously and not allowing yourself to learn and grow within this space. So what happens is if we continue the narrative or we tell our students that it is difficult, they're also going to mirror those difficulties and those perceptions because they're learning from us. So because we are in this virtual space, we're feeling our energy, we're connecting, and there are also some advantages to it that keeps us safe. So the next thing, and they're building off of that topic, is cognition, right? In the classroom, what are the thoughts and the perceptions we want to highlight? How do I feel going in? What am I telling myself going in? What am I thinking going in? And how do I perceive this classroom, right? So what the thing is your perception also allows you to grow, or it could keep you stuck emotionally. So if you're carrying in a negative perception, not that the negativity is not important because it's telling you something. So you need a negative side and a positive side and a battery to create a charge, but you want to own it. Own what you're perceiving and then ask yourself, is this helpful to the situation? Is this helpful to me? How is this impacting my students? And that's not only engaging your problem solving skills, but it's also helping you to reflect and encourage reflective thinking. So what we tend to do is a lot of critical thinking, and that the language or even the perception of critical thinking is where sometimes you're just looking at the problems, but you want to incorporate reflective thinking that looks at both sides. Right? And some people think that they're the same, but they're actually different literature and different definitions of what it is. So reflective helps you to look at the whole picture. How is this perception affecting me in the long run? Right? Let's do you have anything to add before we move on?
Before you move on to the next slide, I have something for the end of this slide.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So building on that as well, we want to talk about reciprocity, right? Where we want to create an empathetic culture. We want to create a culture of gratitude, and we want to create a reward system that is not only linked on just merit in terms of somebody doing, extremely well, but having small increments of rewards even for ourselves. So, today, the virtual space, I felt tired, but I made it through. So that is an internal reward or internal conversation you're having with yourself that is giving yourself a sense of gratitude. You know what, Andrea, you made it through today. But also you're encouraging, that emotional presence within the classroom, within your space. It's something you can encourage your students and yourself to do, which is how could we create a culture and a space that focuses on I'm giving you the knowledge, but I'm also receiving from you as a student, where it's not just a teacher-centered approach, but it's a us approach. So we're encouraging that culture of togetherness. We're creating that sense of alliance. And it's not necessarily a new word, but it's becoming more highlighted in our language and in our environments, even the organizational literature, which is trauma-informed care environment. And trauma-informed care is really where we're creating a space that lessens trauma, that lessens the emotional charge, that helps us to work together within our environment, where we're looking at the person as a human being and not just a resource. So we're not just looking at a child as a grade or a reward for us, or we're not just looking at our colleague as, you need to suck it up and just deal with it. We're creating a space of growth, and we're actually creating a space of care and empathy, right? And a culture that moves everybody along, but not only looks at one part of the system. So the system is actually working as a network, and it's working together as one in a space that can move the whole system along. So you can go ahead, Les.
Thanks, Andrea. I wanted to go back briefly to rewards. We all know how much students like rewards, whether they are intrinsic or extrinsic. Both kinds can be useful, and it's easy to do in the classroom. We all have the experience of, giving rewards, proposing and then giving awards to students in the classroom. A little bit more difficult in a virtual space. However, giving students a little bit of an extra break or an early break for everyone having their cameras on, or for completing the activity, whatever it happens to be. Playing a game. There are lots of online games that can be adapted or that can be used for the virtual teaching space. So those are some things that you can keep in mind, as rewards. I'm going to share my screen again. Because in that same website that I showed you previously, we have another resource that could be very, very helpful, because Andrea was just talking about trauma-informed spaces. So we also have in that same website, trauma-informed teaching and learning. And this part of the website describes it very briefly. It offers, again, these are Canadian resources because it's something that we developed, but they could be helpful in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, or you could adapt them. But if you go further down, we have an information sheet on specifically trauma-informed teaching and learning. And again, this was something that we developed for September of 2020 for back to school last year. So these are the sections or the topics that are covered in this infographic. So basically, what is trauma-informed teaching and learning? Can help you and your students come to a better understanding of what trauma is. What is it, and how does it have anything to do with COVID-19? So that's the second part of this particular sheet. If you scroll down in the sheet, what are some signs of trauma in the classroom? And this is a really, really good section for teachers to familiarize themselves with, because there are some signs of trauma that we can easily detect, right? But there are other signs of trauma that aren't quite so obvious. And so, it's very good to familiarize ourselves with all of those signs of trauma. Strategies for teachers to help students is the next section in this particular infographic that we developed. Positive relationships, positive physical safe, positive priming, using character strengths, both your own and your students, and as Andrea has mentioned, building resilience. The last page includes strategies for teachers to help each other and their schools. Could be very useful. And then other resources for teachers. Again, these are Canadian focused. However, feel free to use them, feel free to adapt them. they are there for you. And once again, this infographic is available at that same link that I provided earlier. Okay. Thank you, Andrea.
You're welcome. Right. So I'm gonna just. All right. Good. So just building on what what we discussed in terms of looking at self-care, not just as the individual, but as a whole, how the individual impacts the environment and how the environment impacts the individual. And also it's important also, especially persons in administration and in management, to also think about how do we as a group, as a teaching community, how do we create a space that looks at our care, the students' care, the parents' care, and our community as well as a whole, right? So we have some activity we want you to engage in before we move on to the skills element and the value system in terms of looking at a mental health pain scale, right? Wes, do you want to share those, or is that this one? Is it this one?
Yep, this is the one, yep.
Right.
I can speak to this. So a little bit earlier, Andrea referenced a check-in in the morning. And as she said, just how is everyone doing today can sound not authentic. And one of the things that I would use at times is just doing a hands up check-in. 5 fingers, the whole hand if you're feeling great. And it can go down to 4, 3, 2, or only 1 finger, depending on how the student is feeling. Very useful in a virtual setting as well, because if the cameras are on, the students are quite able to hold up that hand in front of them and indicate to you exactly how they're feeling. Another resource is something that I found a little while ago that is a mental health pain scale. Now, what you have here in front of you is a scale that goes from 1 to 10. Those are a lot of points on this particular scale and perhaps would be good for adults. And it ranges from mild, how are you feeling? I'm at a 1, I'm good to go. Mild, there's absolutely nothing wrong. And as you read down the screen, then you get to moderate. Oh, 4, today's a bad day, or I've had a few bad days in a row, or I'm feeling lonely, et cetera, et cetera. As we move along the scale, you've got more severe. 7, you're avoiding things. You have a decreased performance. Moving along, you're frustrated, you're annoyed, you can't sleep at night because you've got all these things running around in your head. And it gets even worse from there to a 10. Now, as I said, this is a 10-point scale, might not be appropriate for children. However, you could modify this, right? Depending on what grade level you're teaching, depending on the students you have in the classroom, you know your students the best. Some students in your classroom, if you were to do this activity, and I would suggest that it would be a very good activity to do, some students might want to have a 6-point scale. Some students might have a 2 or 3-point scale. So this is something that you can adapt for your own classroom. Something else I wanted to mention about this is this works for presential learning in the classroom, but it can also work for virtual learning. Now, obviously, kids can't have a scale, but depending on what they decide or what you decide, they could pin something on their shirt, or there are reactions on a Zoom platform. And so students, you could do a check-in. Can everybody give me a check-in? And the students can post a certain reaction on the Zoom platform, right? So there are lots of ways to adapt this kind of resource for different classes, a different number of points on the scale, whatever. You are creative, you know your students, you will know what to do with this. So that's the pain scale. I'd like to move along and talk a little bit about our triggers. So I'm going to bring up this sheet here because we all have triggers, things that set us off. These can be triggers in life. These can be triggers in the classroom as we're working, but I do want to talk about them for just a little while. So this is actually a resource that we use with our Canadian volunteers before they go on their in-service missions to St. Vincent and the Grenadines or to Sierra Leone or to Dominica, wherever it happens to be. So some of the ones that you might be familiar with are money woes. Oh, my child is having problems in school. Too many people are talking at once. I can't focus. This is stressing me out. Trying something new. can be a trigger for some people. Crowds, too many people around. Being around extremely negative or judgmental people. Being alone. Thinking about my anxiety triggers my anxiety. That's true for some people. A little bit further down, losing control of what's going on around me and uncertainty. Living up to the high expectations I place upon myself. Getting older, life in general, it's too busy. Nobody ever takes the time to slow down. And so, if I can stop sharing my screen. Oh, did everybody see that sheet?
My screen was on. Yeah.
No, we actually did not.
Okay,
Yeah.
let me share that again. Pardon me, my apologies. Let me bring that up. So here's the sheet that I was just presenting. My apologies. So again, this is a resource that we've used with our Canadian volunteers. And it's something that I downloaded from the internet, I found, and I highlighted the triggers. The ones that I just read out to you, I have highlighted on this sheet, right? And this was an activity that was done on Facebook that Huffington Post did on Facebook. So there they are again, being alone, thinking about my anxiety, triggers my anxiety, losing control, getting older, not living up to the high expectations I place upon myself. So my apologies for that. So right now, what we're going to do is we're going to do a very brief activity. Not right now, but in a moment, I'm going to ask people who are comfortable doing so to type in the chat what one of their triggers is, if you're comfortable doing so. And then we're going to do a little bit of sharing. I'm going to read them out. We're not going to really discuss them, but we're in a space, a safe space here where we are all teachers and we have all had experiences where we've been anxious in the classroom or something has triggered some kind of reaction in us, whether we show it outwardly or not, right? And that's controlled by the decisions that we make. So I want everyone to start typing in the chat. Don't hit enter yet, but type in the chat one of your triggers. And then when I say go, everyone's going to hit enter. And then I'm going to read out some of the triggers that some of you have. So again, participation is voluntary. You don't have to do this, but if you wish to, you may do so. So go ahead and type something out in the chat. Make sure you have the 2 functions set on everyone. Okay, a few more seconds for you to type it out. Okay, and can everybody press enter? Go. We've got some good stuff coming in. Okay, I'm seeing things such as, if I can get the scroll bar, students talking while I'm teaching. That's everybody. Violent outbursts. Yes, when students don't do the homework that they've been assigned. Having a student that habitually lies. External noise, too much noise. Health issues, be they yours or your students', right? Exams, and again, yours or your students' exams. Going through bad traffic in the morning when you're trying to get to school. Negative people, judgmental people, a lot of noise here. Disrespect, okay? And I'm not sure what the last one, with teachers, not sure what that one means, but that's okay. So good, we've got a really, really good variety of triggers that we know when teachers don't appreciate new teachers. Yes, can certainly identify with that. That's a very important one. And so, yes, so what we need to do is we need to know what our triggers are so that we can better manage them. And that goes for you, but it also goes for your students. So I would suggest that you could do some kind of trigger activity with your students in your classroom, because that will help you to get to know each other better. That will help you to get to know what your expectations are. It will help you to create community and ownership, because when you create resources and when you do activities together, both teacher and students, it creates community, it creates ownership, and it creates respect. And so I would suggest that this could be an activity that you could do. So we've talked about the triggers, the things that set you off. What can you do to help yourself in those situations? And so I'm also going to share another resource now, which is about, which is about affirmations. Here we go. And affirmations are those little things that we can say to ourselves to help us get through the moment, right? So take a deep breath, breathe in. I'm a strong, independent person. I've got this. I am prepared for change. I am strong. This too shall pass. I can stand this. I am relaxed. I am calm. I am attracting positive energy into my body. My anxiety does not control me. I can take things one step at a time. I've survived this before. I can do it again. I'm courageous. I can make it through. This is only temporary, right? This too shall pass. I've made it before. I'll make it again, and so on and so on. So another activity then that I would like to do, and I think you all saw that sheet. I hope I did it right this time, right? Yep, good, thank you. So I'm going to do the very same thing now in the chat that we just did previously. I want everyone to think about an affirmation that perhaps you've used in the past that has helped you get through the moment, or perhaps imagine that you're going to start using affirmations or that you're going to try them. Imagine that an affirmation that you could use in the future that will help you get through that moment. You know yourself the best. You know what the things are that you need to hear. And there's nothing wrong with saying them to yourself, right? We often depend on other people to help calm us down or to say the things that we need to hear. But there's nothing wrong with us saying them for ourselves as well. So, same thing. Think about an affirmation that you've used in the past that has worked that you would like to share, or think about something that you could say to yourself to get you through that moment. Start typing it in the chat. Again, make sure it says to everyone. And we're going to take a little bit of time for that. And then when I say go, we're going to hit enter again. But for now, just type your response in the chat. And I see God is able. I know that our faith will help us through at times as well. So I'll give people a couple more seconds and you can hit return. Go. So we have this too shall pass. Stay positive, you've got this. They will get it. Don't worry. Yes, when the students don't understand and it's clear to you, but it's not clear to them, big source of frustration, they're going to get it eventually. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I am confident. I can do this. A new day is new possibilities. That's a really good affirmation for when you get out of bed in the morning or when you're driving to work or when you're walking to work. New day, new possibilities. Good things are going to happen. I'm strong. All will be well. Life is what you make of it. That's a very good one. Nothing lasts forever. You know, laugh or sing, calm down, take a deep breath, etc., etc. I know the plans you have made for me, Lord. I can do this and I will succeed. Wonderful. These are very good affirmations. So again, I would suggest that this is an exercise that you could do with your students as well. They have anxieties from La Soufrière. They have anxieties from Tropical Storm Grace, perhaps. They have anxieties from COVID-19. They have anxieties from other things that are going on in their lives, right? So helping them develop this self-talk and these affirmations can be an excellent skill that can serve them very well in their life as a student and beyond, right? Thanks, Andrea.
Right. Thank you so much, Wes. And to build on those activities, and why I'm happy Wes did them as a teacher, is that you don't have to be a counselor to start these simple activities. What they're doing is, if you look at the theory of trauma, they're grounding you. So they're helping you to be aware what is happening, what is affecting me, and then what am I going to do about it to help me to be flexible? And that's what we're linking back to that first slide in terms of looking at executive functioning. The truth is, each of us deal with situations differently, but what fuels a lot of the mental health challenges is there's no closure. So with trauma, if there's no closure, it continues and it builds. So eventually your classroom becomes a threat, your work becomes a threat, and you begin to build defense mechanisms that can trap you and can cause your work to be very laborious and a huge task moving forward. So we hope that these activities help you to really be self-aware and to develop small or a different ways that you can create balance for yourself, especially in situations where you can't control But because in the Caribbean, we don't encourage a culture of checking in with ourselves and really paying attention to our mental health and our emotions, what happens is we now have these issues that then affect moving forward, how we feel healthy and how we feel safe in our space. So another thing I want to add as well, Wes, something that I also do just as a therapist is asking persons, what do you want to celebrate? So you can ask yourself, what am I celebrating today, right? Whether it be small, whether it be big. And then you can ask yourself, what am I still struggling with? So it brings to awareness what you need to work on. And there's an activity as well that you can think about as we go into the skills in terms of looking at stop, think, act, right? So you take a moment, you stop, you breathe, and then you ask yourself, is this helpful or is this harmful, right? Is it helpful for me to be doing this or is it harmful for me to be doing this? And then you act on it. You create a solution that can move you from that situation and help to ground you to create a better solution that will benefit both you and your students and your community. So as we go into the skills, there are 2 skills we want to highlight. Not that the others are not important, but we want you to think about resilience and adaptability, and also thinking about managing burnout. How do you create that growth mindset? So I'm going to show a short video on understanding resilience and adaptability and how they work together. And I tend to not like to use the word bounce back for
It's 7 o'clock.
resilience. That's my laptop. I like to use moving forward. Okay. Are we seeing? Why you're not going to play? Just give my laptop a moment. All right, so I'm not sure why it's deciding to update. Let me pull it up from another thing and then I'm going to, oh. Right, so I'm gonna pull it from another platform and see if it works. Give me a few minutes here. That's technology for you.
Mm-hmm. Anxiety, stress, self-talk, Andrea, you've got this, you can do it.
Thank you, Wes. So I'm gonna share it. Okay, good. So are you seeing my screen? Right, so here's where I would have got it from. Come on. Okay. So I think it's probably my internet, but it should be coming up.
And adaptability skills, and why are they important? First, let's look at resilience.
Right, so I'm gonna start from the beginning.
So what are resilience and adaptability skills, and why are they important? First, let's look at resilience. The dictionary defines resilience as either the power to return to the original form or position after being bent, compressed, or stretched, or the ability to recover readily from adversity. Resilience is coping with adversity, unpleasant, difficult, or challenging circumstances. It's sometimes referred to as bouncing back. In a sense, resilience is about how we cope with adversity on an emotional or psychological level in order to help us deal with it practically. Resilience is a quality that we possess which influences our behaviour and the actions that we take. What about adaptability? Well, adaptability is defined as the ability to change or be changed to fit changed circumstances. So adaptability is more about behaviour. It's about what we actually do when it becomes clear that something needs to change. Adaptability isn't always linked to adversity. Sometimes the change isn't particularly negative, but you still need to adapt to positive changes as well as challenges. For example, if you've got a promotion at work to a management position, you might not need to be particularly resilient, but you would need to adapt to the new responsibilities. So why are these things important? Well, as an ancient Greek philosopher once said, change is the only constant. If there is one thing that is certain, it's that we need to be able to cope with change in life. And sometimes that change can be difficult, perhaps something that we weren't expecting or we don't really want to be happening. And that's where resilience comes in. Resilience and adaptability are therefore closely linked and often talked about together. Going back to our dictionary definitions, we consider that one definition of resilience talks about returning to the original form or position. So in other words, perhaps we've coped, but we haven't necessarily moved on. For employability, and probably for all aspects of life, the real value is in combining the quality of resilience with the skill of adaptability, not just coping, but also growing, learning, and changing to fit new circumstances rather than remaining static. Some people are probably naturally more resilient than others. Just as with all employability skills and attributes, different people have different strengths and personal characteristics. But resilience and adaptability can be developed. The first step is self-awareness. How resilient and adaptable are you?
So let me just, okay. So good. So we, in looking at resilience and adaptability as a skill, it's where they both work together to help us grow. So pulling from the video where we realize that you can be resilient in coping, and I think a lot of persons coped, but where we struggle is that we can not be adapting to change, which then affect our ability to pivot and affects our ability to thrive in the virtual space or in the classroom space. So if we're thinking of moving back to a face-to-face space, a lot of thinking is going to be happening in terms of keeping yourself safe, in terms of keeping your students safe, in terms of keeping everybody who's in your community safe. And with that it can have its own challenges, because you hear persons grieving what was and not recognizing that we may not go back to those things ever. So adaptability is that skill that is going to help you have a healthy mental health approach to thriving in this new environment. And we also want to pull out other skills like creativity, reflective thinking, problem solving, and peer relationships, or networking, as we sometimes hear it mentioned. We're networking today, where you've reached out to persons who are in a different field set and some in similar field sets. But within your union, you're building on information and really finding a way to grow and to move. And those are the skills you want to take from this setting and place them into the classroom setting. Also networking with your students, asking them what works for you, having that check-in with them and saying, okay, we had class today and I noticed a lot of persons were not paying attention. What is happening? Instead of just shouting and saying paying attention, is to find a way, okay, this isn't working, so how can I adapt it to them based on also the cultural and developmental differences that we have. And that is also incorporating empathetic thinking as well, and really creating a culture of empathy. You know, I may have 7-year-olds or 8-year-olds in a class and they're sitting down staring at a screen for about a half an hour. Where in class, they could have looked out the window. If they're in face-to-face setting, they could have talked to their friend. They don't have that anymore. So then maybe I need to break up my class. So that's how you create a sense of adapting and thriving and being creative. Because if you then are not looking inward and looking outward, it can make you frustrated. And then you're not learning from the experience, right? Wes, do you have anything to add before we move on?
Yeah, actually, I have a video that I would like to share as well, Andrea, that demonstrates all of the skills that you have listed on the previous slide. And it's something that comes from St. Vincent. And so I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to bring up this. Maybe you've seen this, maybe you haven't, but this is a rant that this particular woman composed and performed about the eruption of La Soufrière. And this comes from St. Vincent. So you may be familiar with it, you may not be, and I hope you can hear it.
All these years you wore that one green dress. We never suspected that you were so depressed. I've heard about midlife crisis, but never did I expect this. On the verge of your birth date, you behaved like you couldn't wait. So without any plan, you decided to attack our land. Draped in a big grey frock, you decided to make a comeback. Like the modern birthday girls, you flaunted your head full of curls. Up in the air, you ascended. And just like that, your rat descended. Even though we knew your birth date was around the corner, for some reason, we thought that you might have waited a bit longer. But no, I guess you got the attention you were after. Because just like that, we are in a state of disaster. Our families were displaced. You threw us right on our face. Our nation is in mourning. And you still have the audacity to be groaning. Our backs are against the wall, but Jehovah God will never let us fall. Like any other, we will recover. Our faith will see us through, even if we have to endure you. Our nation is blessed. That I can attest. So even in this natural disaster, today, I will call on the Master. St. Vincent and the Grenadines shall rise again. God will reign.
Okay. So actually, I believe it was Oswald who sent that to me shortly after the eruption of La Soufrière. And I just look at that and I just think of, wow, what a way to turn a negative into a positive, and channeling that negative energy into through creativity into a beautiful, beautiful product. And I think that again refers to the metaphor that Andrea used earlier about the positive and the negative charges on the battery, right? And so one of the reasons why I wanted to show you this video is because why not in your own classrooms have your students do a rant about COVID-19, or to have your students do a rant about some other topic that is causing them anxiety, right? I think it would be an excellent way for them to communicate to you what some of their anxieties are. And it could be COVID-19, it could be something else. And so I really did want to share that video with you because I just found it to be such an excellent example of turning a negative into a positive. Yeah, thanks, Andrea.
You're welcome. And that also incorporates, the creative thinking. And one thing I think we miss sometimes is that each of us has an inner child in us. And even if you're working with adults or you're working with adolescents, even in my sessions as a therapist, having adults color or create something is very cathartic in itself, because we're activating a part of our brain that helps us to move things along and to look at things in a different perspective. And you also are looking at a way of relieving stress for you and also for your students as well as you go back into the classroom. So you want to be able to help yourself and your students and even your other colleagues to to develop a sense of problem solving, reflective, and building on those skills and value sets. So we're going into looking at classroom strategies. And in terms of looking at the virtual space, it's important when you sit and when you look at your skill set, and even though you may be lacking in those areas in terms of understanding e-learning and the virtual space, even tapping into some of the resources what sort of showed you in terms of the websites, there are lots of international material available that we can use in the and there's also Caribbean material as well. So one of the things you want to create is a manual or a written blueprint in terms of how am I going to navigate the virtual space. I'm a little old school where I think writing helps, or creating a mind map helps to create that strategy to help you to understand where you're going. So it's not that you're trying to control every element, but one of the things that help our brain to relax is to anticipate what the next step could be through a plan. It may not work out, but structure helps to minimize chaos. And everybody knows themselves. So if you're a person who doesn't do well with change, planning helps, but you also leave that small window or that small room. Just like my situation where video did not play and I downloaded it so early. You have to find a way now to pivot, but you have that room open for disappointment in terms of looking at the virtual space. Also thinking about COVID-19 and other natural disasters. We're in the hurricane season, we experience a volcanic eruption. Based on where you're situated, having policies. One of the things we need to start developing as Caribbean people, and has been mentioned, is policy making, creating that structure, having something that you can pull from, having something that not only incorporates or waiting until something happens, but preparing ahead. Also looking at other institutions outside of our country and seeing what did they consider, even thinking of things like child abuse, gender violence, how do we incorporate that into our policies and creating a trauma-informed environment. Even thinking about grief and loss. If somebody experiences something or a child experiences something, we're not just sending them down to the counselor, but how do we create a space that incorporates that? Not that you're going to create a trauma triggering environment, or you're playing, you want to be a counselor, because as a teacher you can't be a counselor and teacher at the same time. But it's also creating that space and that strategy. So what if a child does this? How do I intervene? How do I create that space to manage my mental health as well? Because if you're doing dual roles and you're wearing multiple hats, and you're functioning in different ways, you're going to be burnt out and you're going to be stretched. So how do I understand my environment? And even if there's a lack in that environment, how do I outsource it? So there are a lot of different communities and schools that can work together to even build that. I know from my own experience, sometimes you may get calls and say, Andrea, could you help in this area? We have this person. So you have a network and find out what are the resources in my, going back to that post that Wes showed, what are the resources in my community or even the resources in the Caribbean that I can use to create these policies. The next one is creating a psychologically safe environment for staff and students. Going back to that slide, we talk about language, body language, how we speak to each other. We can be harsh sometimes when we're frustrated. How do we think before we speak, or use that element of empathy? Do we pay attention to how our behaviors affect our students? So if we're anxious coming into the classroom, do we pay attention to how that affects our students, affects our peers, how our own attitudes affect each other? And also in our blueprint, in our environment, in our vision or mission statement, is there a culture that thinks about psychological safety? In terms of how we create a mentally healthy environment for each other. So it's not just in terms of the external affecting the internal, but how is the internal affecting those small groups? And what are those subcultures that we have in our groups that are impacting the psychological safety? The next one is creating a brain-friendly environment. Sometimes our own anxieties to just want to meet the curriculum can create a very heavily laden environment. And what happens then is that we're more focused on the outcome rather than the process. So if we think of the human brain, and I think every teacher would have done introduction to psychology at some point, or would have done some elements of special needs, but we tend to throw it out the window sometimes when we're under pressure. So it's really to think about creating brain-friendly spaces, paying attention to how we speak to persons. We realize we're not getting it, then okay, maybe my language is too big, or maybe I am not speaking clearly. Is it that the person may have a learning difficulty that they're not aware of? So all those different things you want to think about in creating a brain-friendly environment. Maybe putting more signage around your school, having information be sent at an earlier time rather than sending a notice in the morning and expecting for the person to show up at 1. All those things raise anxieties as well. The next thing is creating a realistic process rather than a grand idea. So I don't want to specify culture, because I think in every culture, all of us do it, where we come with these great and grand ideas and then we forget the process. So we want to have a check-in, or have somebody to check in to say, okay, this is lovely, but how are we getting there? Do we have the resources to get there? Is it going to be too much of a strain? Is it going to pull at our teachers? So we want to have this grand change, but what is the process? Is the timeline realistic? Can our staff and our students handle this timeline and handle this idea? Is this a 5-year project versus a 1-year project? So all those different things affect mental health, because what we're doing is pushing something beyond maybe the human capacity, or pushing the human capacity to meet an idea that probably doesn't have a process, and that raises stress levels. The next one is having a humanizing classroom, or a cathartic classroom. You know, as Wes and I was preparing, one thing I highlighted to him is that we spent a lot of time teaching young people how to express themselves and how to really be open, but we forgot to think about those generational gaps where some of our generations are not exposed to that kind of cathartic language. So what happens is it can be interpreted as disrespect. It can be interpreted as, or it may not be interpreted as information that is important because of how it's expressed. So we want to have a level of respectful expression in terms of allowing each other to share, but having the willingness to listen and listening to understand. Sometimes we listen to hear and not listen to understand. And that can also affect our mental health, because we don't feel as though we belong, we don't feel heard, we don't feel included. And then that also deteriorates a person's self-concept, it deteriorates his self-esteem on both levels. And then what happens is we forget that we're teaching human beings, or we're interacting with human beings, and we look at them as products. So we want to be able to create a classroom that is human friendly, is also creating a culture of openness, but respectful openness, and being able to learn from each other in a very helpful and open way. The next one we want to think about in creating classroom strategies in terms of mental health is looking at reducing grade performance, but focusing on learning performance. And that also takes into account the teacher or the employee in the institution. Sometimes when we're doing performance appraisals, we focus on just criticizing rather than looking at how did the person grow and what are they learning. Is our environment focusing on an area of growth, or do our employees feel stuck? Because if you have staff who feel stuck and there are no avenues for growth, that also affects their mental health and also their performance in the long run. So we want to be able to look at how are they learning and adapting and moving in the environment, rather than just focusing on a grade or meritocracy system. And then you want to look at identifying key learning points. So you're looking at making the curriculum brain friendly, making it more realistic. Sometimes when you develop things, it could be only based on one culture, one mindset. And even, yes, we have curriculum blueprints and curriculum structures that we want to look at. We also want to think about in terms of, even though this is what it is, can I modify the structure based on what I'm seeing, based on what I'm experiencing, based on what is helpful to this moment? So if I have, students who are, what's going on here? If we have students who are affected in terms of they're not growing or they're not developing? Do I need to make some small adjustments? Because that also affects my anxiety as a teacher in terms of I am thinking, am I doing what's best for them? So as I said, reciprocity, it's a give and take. So if I create an alliance where the student is able to open up and say, well, this isn't working for me, what can I do then to help them, right? The next statement we want to look at is looking at a needs-friendly space and curriculum, where we're looking at the needs of the child or the student or the person we're interacting with. We're looking at the needs of our staff. So even though you don't create a curriculum for your staff, you create a blueprint in terms of what you want to do for the year. Something is happening here. My apologies. Am I still host? Right. So you want to create a need space that allows your students and your staff to grow, but also focus on their individual needs and also focusing on the group needs as well, right? Wes, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, sure, thank you. And a lot of these things that Andrea is talking about is acting as a community, right? That's what this comes down to, because your classroom is a community, your school is a community, your virtual learning platform is a community when your students are online. And so I think you can all see me because I'm speaking. So I'm just going to hold this up. I don't need to share screen. And I think you can see this. This is a resource that we've developed at the CTF, which is called Mental Health Stigma, Challenging It Together. And I'm going to provide a PDF of this booklet to the SVGTU, and they will be able to share it to you. But what this is a booklet that comes from our Student Voice series. And what this series of booklets is all about is the student voice. Basically, most of the content of the booklet, of each booklet in this series, comes from students in the classroom. We get volunteer teachers, we send them a set of focus questions to use in the classroom, and then the students respond to those questions. They can do it with art, they can do it with their words, and then we publish a booklet, which is an assemblage of all of their responses. So this particular one is on the topic of mental health stigma, and it's got some really good questions in it that you can use and have your students respond to, or you could develop similar questions for your own context, for your own classroom. And there's nothing preventing you from creating your own booklet with your own students about whatever topic you wish. But since we're talking about teacher mental health and self-care, it could be classroom mental health and classroom self-care, and you could develop your own booklet like this, right? And so I'm really, really proud of this series that we've put out, because all of the content is student response. It is student driven, it is organic, it comes straight from the horse's mouth, as the expression goes. And I would encourage you to perhaps create a classroom resource, because once again, we know that when you do something together, it creates community, as I mentioned earlier, it creates ownership, it creates respect, and it opens up the lines of communication. And so once again, this will be sent to you. The link to the PDF of this booklet will be sent to you. You can read through it. There will be perhaps some parts that you would like to use with your own students in your own classrooms. And as I said, if you're a little bit more adventurous, create a classroom resource together with strategies, with the children's opinions, with their own thoughts on the topic. It can be very, very, very powerful. And as Andrea said, it can be very cathartic as well.
Right, thank you so much, Wes. And it's important as well as teachers on your own to really build your professional development and understanding mental health and emotional health, to really grow your practice as a teacher, but also to connect with yourself and your colleagues and your students. So we want to add some values now, some values and some characteristics that I think is important to embody to have a healthy mental health, to practice healthy mental health as you go forward for your own self, but also among your colleagues in your classroom as well, to really cement your role as a teacher, but helping you to go through this process in a very smooth way. So the first one we'll look at is accountability. And accountability and responsibility are different because it's really where you're acknowledging where you're wrong and acknowledging when you're right and what do I do with that. And sometimes that's difficult to really digest because you can be responsible and do what you have to do, but you're really not accountable and you're really not aligning yourself with the growth process. So accountability also for your students as well. We want students to be accountable, but sometimes we're not accountable to them when we are incorrect or when we do things wrong. And that creates a rift also that can impact our own mental health. It affects the relationship with our students, it affects our relationship with our colleagues, and that also impacts our work in the long run. The second one is empathy, and that's really about, am I understanding what's happening? Am I understanding how the person feels? Am I understanding how they think? Even though we may disagree, can I still look at their perspective and get a sense of what they're saying and what they're doing, especially when we're encountering behavioral problems, or even if we're encountering difficult colleagues. So you might hear persons venting and we respond to the emotion, but we're not responding to the need or what they're saying. And that's where empathetic thinking comes in, where I'm able to take myself out of the emotion and make it about them and understand what they're feeling. And then how can I address it? How can I find a way to meet their need if it's necessary in some respect? Or how can I even just create that small shift to even keep myself grounded in terms of how do I exist in this space with them. The next one is vulnerability. And when we think about vulnerability, we think about trust. And when I talk about vulnerability and trust, is where you're giving small pieces for the appropriate situation. Sometimes when we think about each other as colleagues, we think of it as, we have to have these close attachments and we bound ourselves to people. And when they don't meet our expectations, we get really disappointed. But if we're able to give out small levels of trust in terms of being aware of who the person is, are we willing to accept who they are, but also know how much of ourselves to give, it makes the relationship and the dynamic really easier to navigate. And that's where boundaries come in. So for example, I've never met Wes before, but I know he's a professional. We're doing this together. And I could trust him based on what I observe and the information he gives, but I don't need to trust him with other elements of my life because that is not the relationship we have. So it's really understanding how much vulnerability to give to create alliance, but not an enmeshment of a relationship, because not everybody is able to support us from one stage to the next. And that is how we open up ourselves to create disappointment in our relationships that can then create conflict moving forward. The next one is honesty. And honesty and accountability are linked, but honesty in itself is where can we find a space that we can let our students know that I don't know about this, right? Or let me find out about it, rather than taking an authority stance. Or even in our workplace, even if we don't have a good relationship with management, can we find somebody to be honest with? And as Wes talk about those rants, can we be open with and then find out if the person can advocate on our behalf? But also, can we be honest with ourselves? Again, when we talk about the negative and the positive creating a charge, what we tend to do when we experience negative emotions, we push them aside because we want to create a quick fix. And sometimes we lie to ourselves and say we're okay. And then the affirmation may come in right away sometimes without us even acknowledging how we're feeling. If you notice how we introduce the activities, the affirmation came last because we have to identify what's happening before we can get to a positive space. If we don't be honest with ourselves and recognize, look, this environment is becoming too much, I probably need to take some time off, I probably need to speak to somebody, we need to develop some policies about it. What happens, we have what we call toxic positivity, and that can cloud you and create blind spots. So you want to be able to be honest, both with yourself, both in your community, both with your students, your colleagues, in order to move forward. And then we're going to talk about characteristics to build balance. So again, trust, self-support systems, but external support systems. who in my community can support me and how much trust do I invest in that community. And I think as a teachers union, you have a strong body among yourself to identify who do we trust to support us, but even individually, can I trust myself to support myself and support my emotions? Because there are some emotions that you have to go through on your own and by yourself. The next one is positive attitudes. Sometimes some persons may not know how to step into a positive attitude or not know how to think of how can we create that balance. So problem solving and creative thinking is another element that can help you incorporate or develop a positive attitude. So going back to the video that Wes showed with her name is Jacinta, I think, talking about the volcanic eruption and how she made it into such a creative piece where it does have elements of it that shows the destruction and the tragedy of La Soufrière, but it also shows how something so destructive can create such beauty. Our vegetation is much more lush. There's certain things that we didn't even think about that we're thinking about now. And that is a positive element that can come out of that as well. Because positivity is not only about just jumping up for joy, but it's also looking at confidence. It's also looking at being brave. It's also looking at being courageous. It's also being curious and inspirational and being optimistic. So you want to have those positive attitudes moving forward. So you have a balanced sense in your classroom, even if you're experiencing things that are negative. The next one, and we both of us would have stressed it as well, is self-awareness, knowing yourself, right? I know when I'm feeling stressed, I tend to look on Amazon for shoes and not do my work. So that's my cue that I have something that's going on that I need to address because I'm avoiding certain things. Now, the thing is, defense mechanisms hold us, but they can't sustain us. And when we talk about defense mechanisms in terms of avoidance, in terms of repressing things, in terms of pushing them away, but after a while it breaks. So you need to be able to check in with yourself at some point and recognize, is this too much? Do I need to speak to someone? Do I need to create a solution that works? Do I maybe need to put a Band-Aid on it and then come back to it at some point, right? And the next one is authenticity, or being authentic. Really showing your strengths and your true self is important, but also you have to know yourself first before you can be authentic. And the truth is, authenticity grows with experience and it expands. So you want to always kind of check in with yourself. And am I being true to my students? Am I being true to myself? Am I being true to my colleagues? And then stepping into a space of resilience, which is moving forward and finding a way to have that extra push in order to navigate through the adversity. Sometimes you find your inner strength through adversity. But if you don't understand what the adversity is saying to you, if you're not clear, you can find yourself overwhelmed by it. So that's why incorporating these characteristics are important. And with resilience comes a progressive mindset through my behavior, through my body language, through my emotion. And in even discussing this presentation, we talked about comparison. You know, comparison is the enemy of progress. If you keep comparing yourselves to each other, I can't present the same way as Wes, and Wes can't present the same way as me. But both of us have something special that can make this presentation meaningful and also help it to move forward in a particular way. And last but not least, growth. Checking in with yourself in terms of, do I need to do some additional training? Do I need to work on, you know, pushing my career, advancing myself as a union? Do we need to do things together to kind of move everybody along? So it's really the individual versus the group. Because everything you do impacts the group, and everything the group does impacts the individual. So it's really building those characteristics in order to have a mentally sound and a balanced mindset and a balanced person moving forward as teachers. Unless you have anything else to add before I move forward?
Yeah, just one comment about growth is just like in your classroom, don't try to do too much too soon. You know yourself the best. You know what you're capable of. You know what your own limitations are, especially if you're being honest with yourself. So we have an expression that we use, baby steps, right? Take baby steps. You don't need to take a big leap, right? Just move forward by baby steps, and then the leaps will come, right?
So I found this quote. I'm not sure if you can see it. Schools can't become best places for students to learn and grow unless we make them the best places for teachers to work and grow, right? And it's so important to take care of each other, to take care of yourself, and as an institution, to look at the whole education system as well, in terms of how can we create some structure in having that balance where there isn't just one side focusing on students, one side focusing on teachers, but we're looking at it as a whole. So some things that we want to talk about is in terms of creating policies, and this is really crucial to mental health. And and because most of my training is in policy making, I think it makes no sense. You have these workshops and you have these programs and there isn't anything on paper to carry it forward. So one thing you want to think about is looking at psychological safety to be incorporated in your policies, not only for students, but for your staff, for every element of the education system, from principal to security guard. How can we create a psychologically safe space? And what are we going to put in writing? So we gave you some words this afternoon and this evening, sorry, in terms of looking at trauma-informed care, trauma-informed teaching. There's so much material and information on trauma-informed care. And it's the new fabric of what's moving institutions along in many different spaces, not only in the education system, in the healthcare system, in organizations as well, in HR. This is something that has been around for like almost the last 3 years, but it's been more an emphasis now because COVID and the pandemic, and even in St. Vincent and Grenadines, eruption has created so many different elements of trauma that we never thought about before, right? Social media training, having your teachers understand that you're not supposed to be publishing your students online, especially when in a particular age. Those violate certain international policies on child abuse. Am I setting up my students for pedophiles because we're in a humanitarian crisis? Are we opening up ourselves to be recognized as a structure or a place that doesn't have proper policies protecting children? Knowing, seeing if our acts or certain social justice elements, do they have social media training in place? I know for me in certain institutions where I've worked on, we had to do social media training and sign confidentiality contracts to make sure that we keep, information safe. How we portray ourselves on social media is important as well, in terms of what are we highlighting as an institution and as an organization and as a profession. Looking at cybersecurity, social media, again, cyberbullying, even thinking about is our Zoom platform encrypted enough to keep persons from outside? How do we create those classroom rules and making sure that our students have their names, that they have on their cameras, that, persons aren't coming into the platform and doing different things? Having our teachers and principals and institution personnel trained on these things in terms of even understanding cybersecurity, in terms of how do we ask permission from our students to take their pictures, or do our parents sign contracts as well to get permission because we could take it for granted. Oh, we're in the virtual space and we're doing all of these things, but are we paying attention to those policies and those standards? Policies in terms of working from home. How do we clock those hours in? How do we measure that? How do we need to create a virtual manual for working from home, or even creating a classroom setting? Do we need training and policies for that? Because you can get the training, but if there's nothing in writing, it just falls apart. Looking at self-care action plans. Do we need to put a policy in there? As a psychologist, we are trained for self-care to know when we're supposed to, our ethics keep us bound to manage and monitor ourselves. But as a teacher, do we need to add that into our policies as well, where self-care is something that is mandatory, having a mental health day as a part of our policies as well, incorporating that as well? So we have sick leave, but then does sick leave incorporate mental health or psychological disorders in that respect? Looking at compassion fatigue, burnout, vicarious trauma. Do we understand what those words mean? And and the language associated with that. Something that was a nice spoke about in terms of looking at an employee assistance program, an EAP, and what that is where you have persons contracted to provide psychological support for our teachers. And where we're not having teachers counseling teachers, because that is unethical within itself. So you have that safe space for persons to access support, where they're able to get psychotherapy, debriefing. A lot of teachers would have worked in shelters for the volcanic eruption. Have they been able to process what has been happening? Have we checked in with them to see if they're up, are they, what is their emotional temperature? Have we been able to assess before we send them back into the classroom? And last and not least, are we thinking about healthy HR practices in terms of what do our environments look like? We check in to see what are the space, how much resources do we have, or how are we also with students, how are we managing those parent-teacher dynamics and those involvements in there? So those are some policies and things that we want to think about moving forward as well, and creating a mentally healthy space for teachers. Wes, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, one more link that I'm going to share in the chat just in a moment is back in February of this year, the CTF partnered with another Canadian organization to offer what was called the Youth Resilience in the Digital Age Conference. And it was a virtual conference. It was a series of 10 virtual workshops that were developed in partnership between the CTF and 10 different civil society organizations in Canada in order to provide educators with training on a variety of topics, but it touches on things like cybersecurity. It touches on things like online safety. It touches on things like online inclusion and how do you get the shyest of your students to turn on their cameras and participate in the lessons. I'm going to tell you one right now. There was one particular presentation by the Jays Care Foundation. I don't know if anybody knows the Toronto Blue Jays. They are a baseball team, but they raise a lot of money and they give a lot of money back to the community. And their presentation in particular was very good for suggesting games that you can play in the virtual space with your students. And so I'm going to put that information into the chat as well. I'm not going to show you the website because that will take up too much time and we're getting a little bit close to the end, but I will give you the link and I do invite you to explore when you do have some time. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me now? Good. Okay, so as we wrap up and we come to the end and we have some time for questions because we're going well with time. So we want to really cement that mental health and balance in self is essential in teaching. And good mental health is about self-awareness. It's about looking at the whole self. So not only looking at just psychological safety, but also looking at emotional safety, also looking at the environment, also looking at all the 8 dimensions of well-being that we touched on earlier in the slides. We want to think about creating healthy environments and trauma-informed spaces to help promote a psychologically safe environment for teachers and learning. So we're not just thinking about the students, we're thinking about our teachers, all levels of teaching, so new, more mature teachers, persons who are retiring, we're thinking about them as well. Persons who resign, we're thinking about them as well. How do we create spaces and to meet those different needs and meet persons at different levels? In terms of mental health, we're thinking of being our authentic self and building an alliance with your students, parents, and community. And all of these things help teachers' mental health. The community impacts the education system and the education system impacts the community. How can we work together? Teachers impact students and students impact teachers. How can we work together? So it's looking at it as a whole umbrella, but not just picking pieces apart. And healthy mental health practices and policies are crucial to build a progressive education system. We are all a part of the system. So we want to make sure that we're not only having training, yes, but we have policies in place that can stand, that set the tone for the standards and the quality of interaction we want to promote a mental health or mentally healthy environment for our teachers. Great. And that's the end of our presentation. I'm not sure if you want to add anything, Wes, before we close and open the floor for questions.
No, I don't have anything to add. I've been able to share. Thank you very much. All of the the resources that I wanted to bring to the teachers tonight. So thank you very much.
All right. So thank you so much, Teachers Union, for the opportunity, and we appreciate being here. And we open the floor for any questions or comments that persons would like to us to help them with.
Thank you very much, Wes. Thank you very much, Ms. Mojes. At this time, persons who are teachers, I know there might be a lot of teachers who have a lot of questions. I must say that it was a very informative presentation. I did not know that, that teachers could encounter so many difficulties from so many areas, and the way we start our day, the way we approach our students, everything kind of blends in together. And it is important also that we work hand in hand with each other in ensuring that our work environment is not stressful. Also that even principals have a role to play, and even how we approach our students, it could determine how our classes go. So I must say, great presentation. I really enjoyed the presentation a lot. So at this time, I don't know if I figured teachers would have questions. I know it was very, very informative. But let's see. Persons who have questions, you can, if you want, you can turn on your camera, or you can unmute your mic and state your name and go ahead and ask your questions. From the comments, I'm seeing that a lot of persons are saying that it was a very, very informative presentation. And some of them are even saying they're looking forward to applying some of those knowledge, the knowledge gained in the classroom. So it is very good to know
that. Good night, Brother Abdon. This is Andrew John.
Hi, good night, Brother Andrew. How are you doing?
Yes, it's not really a question I have, but just a comment in stating, I want to state to the presenters how happy I am that they have really taken on the role this evening to present on this very, very important topic. As we know, we have gone through so much over the past year and a half as a nation, as teachers, and I know it would have impacted. So I know this topic is crucial, and I really think that they did a good job. They did justice to the topic. And so I just want to thank them. I am also very, very pleased to have the Canadian Teachers Federation on board this evening, starting this evening, and we will have 2 more sessions with them on board, and I'm inviting others to join. I think the next session would be on motivation, and we have one on leadership where the CTF would be on board. So just thanking them, thank Ms. Mojes for doing a very great job, and that's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Want to raise their hand, Ms. Gibbons? You can go.
Hi, good night. I just want to say I am elated to be here tonight and participate in this workshop. Wes and Andre did a wonderful job, so I must commend both of you. And I'm so grateful for both of you partnering with us, the Canadian CTF. I would just want to say something as it relates to Andrea, when you were talking before, and I typed in the chat intonation, and it's so important, critically important when it comes to intonation, how we say things to others. I know we might say we are adults, but you know something, we do feel embarrassed at times. We do go into our shy and our embarrassing times, sometimes when somebody speaks to us harshly. Some might say you're not children, so grow up. But when We are adults, we do feel shame at times. So intonation is very important. The tone we set when we speak to others. And sometimes it triggers into the classroom. A child might get us upset, and then we want to shout out at that child. And that child might be going through a psychological problem at his or her home. So coming to the classroom for safety might not be the best option for the child, because the child is met with this same aggressive behavior and the same talk down and shout at, which the child is trying to escape from that child's environment. And I just want to say mental health is very important. And as teachers, all of us, we need to find what we are struggling with, and we need to find solutions. And if we can't find the solutions for ourselves, we need to find somebody that we can trust, somebody that we can talk to, so that we can be better citizens, better teachers, and better people to talk to relate to, and our minds mentally would be more at ease. And when we do teaching, or when we're speaking, or whatever we put our hands to do, there will be this passion. So we don't come to the classroom with our past. I think Wes was looking at mindfulness as it relates to staying in the present and don't look too far into the future, because sometimes we look back so far into our past, where we have all the hurts and the setbacks, and it really hampers us to move forward. So I just want to say I enjoyed this session tonight, and thank both of you. Stay safe.
Thank you for that. There's a really good exercise that you can do in drama. I'm not sure if drama has a very prominent position in CARICOM in the curriculum that you use in the Caribbean and in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but there are great intonation exercises. You can take a simple sentence like, "What are you doing?" And then you can go through a wide range of emotions with it. What are you doing? Or you can be inquisitive. "Oh, what are you doing?"
What are you doing, Wes?
There's the pause. "What are you doing?" And it's a really good drama exercise, and kids love drama. They love to get up and speak and move around and explore and use different spaces. So I would encourage you to incorporate drama into your classrooms, especially during a pandemic or especially in virtual learning, because it can be a very good tool. So thank you for that.
And Mrs. Gittins, too, looking at the individual. So also raising that point in terms of how you speak with each other and how you speak with your students. Sometimes we don't have that inner voice and that inner ear to hear how we sound. So even for myself, in grad school, we had to videotape ourselves and listen to ourselves to see how we connect with a therapist, so connect with our clients. So in terms of teachers, is to look at, if I'm speaking this way, how is the person responding? What are they responding to? Because sometimes persons have naturally loud voices, or sometimes they don't have those calming voices to really connect. And it takes a lot of energy from you when you're upset or when you're angry to step out of that space. So even simple things of breathing is important when you're speaking, enunciating and being deliberate in your words, but also trying not to sound sarcastic or demeaning, practicing it, because no matter what age you are, their change can occur, and it's based on the goal that you want to achieve and the relationship you're trying to build with your peers and with your students as well. So thank you so much for sharing.
Okay, Angie, I just want to make one little more point. For example, you might be faced with a teacher who knows that she might be a shouting teacher, might be an aggressive teacher, but you might hear a teacher say that's just me. I don't want to change. How do you, as a counselor, how do you get across to break that boundary, as in break down that wall that teacher has, not willing to change? Because change is constant, and if you want to be a better teacher, change should be a must. How do you encourage that teacher to vote forward for change?
In terms of the interaction on a peer-to-peer basis is where you help the teacher understand in terms of what is the other goal you want to achieve besides just wanting the students to learn. And they may say, well, that isn't important to me. But then you have to look at too, if you are having those conflicts with the students in terms of your shouting is affecting them, is also to look at that is going to also affect their behavior to you, and do you want that? if I'm looking at it from a counseling or a psychologist perspective, there's a reason why that person is shouting and what they need from that shouting. It's connected from something within. So it could be a defense mechanism, because if I talk soft, people take advantage of me. So that is something we might have to break down. Or they could have a hearing problem and they don't know too, right? And that is something we might have to break down in terms of how are people responding to you when you shout to them, and are you getting good results when that happens? But in terms of on an organizational base, you can set policies and standards in terms of how you want everybody to talk to each other. And then the person will have to look at, because at some point they don't always shout. There's a time when they would have lowered their voice, and then they could look at how did people respond to you like that. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but was that helpful? Yeah.
Yes, it was. Thank you, Andrea.
Okay. Another hand is raised. Oswald Robinson. Please go ahead.
Yes, first of all, I want to appreciate the host for an excellent job, and our General Secretary who set the tone with the prayers. Excellent presentations, Mrs. Games, Mohes, and our brother Westels. This exercise this evening is one that I'm extremely happy about, in the sense that it is clearly showing the SVGTU and the Canadian Teachers Federation, our relationship continues to bear fruit. And this evening is a lovely fruit that has been born from the exercise that we have had. Our teachers today have been provided with an overall development, the skills that you would have spoken about, the knowledge that they have received. And I am sure that many of them would go back now to their schools, to their classroom, and to share. This empowerment is so important at this time, especially that we are going back, we are preparing to go back to school, and we are hearing things about COVID and vaccination and testing, and it's so important. I'm extremely happy. I am overwhelmed. I must commend the course director again for coordinating this whole exercise, ensuring that we reach our teachers. And I'm very happy that, yes, Westels is way up in Canada, but he's here present in St. Vincent de Grand. It was good to see you sharing that video about St. Vincent. So everything, all the illustrations that both presenters would have made fit very smoothly into our context. So our teachers could really relate. They were quite appropriate, quite relevant, and I'm happy that everything flowed quite smoothly. There was a smooth transition from one presentation to the next, and the intervention that you made was quite in order. And I'm extremely happy, and I appreciate, we couldn't find a better choice than both of you to do this very important topic. And I know Mr. John and the General Secretary and the entire executive of the Teachers Union, we are very proud of what transpired this evening. And we want to encourage our teachers to go back and share the experiences that you have had this evening so that you would be better prepared. We are very much concerned about the morale of our teachers. And this is a plus, this is a boost. So I salute both of you. I am actually pregnant with the information that you shared, so I'm preparing to deliver. I'm actually experiencing labor pains at this time. That's a joke, and that sometimes a little joke is good to break the tension, And good job, Abdan, and keep it up. All the best to everyone, and good night.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Do we have any more questions?
I'd just like to say, despite her reservations, I think that Andrea would make an excellent teacher.
I think so too. I definitely think so.
Thank you.
Well, So let me check, see if anyone has their hands up. I'm not seeing any hands up. It's now 8:02. Andrea, Wes, thank you so much. I think today we had at one point up to close to 100 persons in teachers in attendance. Thank you again very much for coming and delivering such a insightful presentation here this afternoon. I think it was well received by our teachers, and from the comments, I think everyone just kept saying great presentation. So thank you again, Andrea. Thank you again, Wes, for being part of this. So the SVGTU CTF Ministry of Education Summer Institute series, it continues right up until the 16th of December. Our next topic will be motivation and the teacher. That will be on September 16th. And then we have leadership and the teacher. Then we have planning and effective ICT inclusive lesson. Then we have session 8, delivering an effective ICT inclusive lesson. Then we have coping with ICT online learning when you can't get online. Session 10, getting the most out of Microsoft Teams. Session 11, getting the most out of Microsoft Teams. So we'll have 2 on that. And that will end our summer institute. Well, it's going to run actually right into fall or winter, as we say. But with COVID and with the volcanic eruption and all of that, the teachers union had to find creative ways. And with persons not being able to travel and all of that, we are so happy, that we could still have our Canadian brothers and sisters join us from time to time. I hope, as Wes said, Andrea, you will make a great teacher. I hope the executive will invite you back another time to work with our members and continue helping them to grow. So we have come to the end. I just want to thank all the participants for being here. And as I said again, two of the most important persons here this evening. Andrea, thank you very much for being a part of this. Wes, this first time I'm meeting you. Thank you very much again for being part of this workshop here today. So at this time,
For the PowerPoint will be made available. We would have sent it to Mr. John.
Right. So the PowerPoint presentation, we will also try to send it to our stewards so they can get it to our teachers, and hopefully we could post it on our Facebook page so persons can also download it and go through the entire presentation. Also, just doing a bit of cleaning matters on Sunday, September the 19th, we will be having our regular Teachers Talk program, and our topic this week would be teacher burnout and self-care, kind of continuing with the same kind of theme. The program will be hosted by our PRO acting, Fiona Charles, and our guest would be Joanne Haynes, a professional counselor, and it will be aired on Extreme Radio or Extreme FM. So you can tune in at 6 p.m. on Sunday evening. All right. So again, I just want to thank everyone for being a part of this session this afternoon. And until the next session, thank you, Brother Robinson, and all the persons who would have asked questions. And thank you again, teachers, for taking the time out to come in and be a part of the program today. So here's where we say goodbye. And I just hope I did not miss anything. Let me just check my messages one more time. All right. And
you missed one thing. You missed God's willing. Okay, nice.
All right. So everyone, again, thank you for coming, and hope to see you at our